there. Happy Thursday. Welcome to Philanthropy Unbound Talks for Black Philanthropy Month. I am Renee Jocelyn, principal at Philanthropy Unbound, and I'm so grateful that you're joining us for these conversations. We will be having 4 discussions during the month of August, this being the first one on infrastructure building. It has been quite a time between Philanthropy Month 2019 and now, and the title or the theme of this year's Black Philanthropy Month could not be more timely, Foresight 2020. How do we use this time of opportunity to rebuild, rethink, restructure? I know that you've been having these conversations in your organizations. I know you've been having them amongst your friends and your family, and even maybe just with yourself. But I'm hoping that today we can have them together as a community and build on them. So today, as I mentioned, is the first of 4 discussions, and they will focus on what we're doing right and what we can do better. This one is infrastructure building. Then we'll talk about competing for funding, financing Black-led social change, and how do we protect our hearts, minds, and bodies as we do this most important work. Before moving into discussion, I want to make sure to thank my advisors who worked really hard to help me think through these topic areas, and were great with thought leadership and guidance. Ema Gordon-Reed, Yvonne Moore, George Suttles, Seytu Jamel Hart, and Marcus Little. And while I'm at it, I want to thank the DJ for pulling us into this conversation today and getting us our bodies ready and our minds ready for this deeper conversation. Thank you all and all the team that helped to pull this together, my tribe, as I call them. So, okay, this is how it's going to go. First, we'll have a mindful moment to center and ground ourselves. Yes, I'm that girl, and yes, that is happening. The mindful moment will be led by Yolo Akili of BEAM, our nonprofit partner, and BEAM stands for Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. This mindful moment is just, again, to center us and make sure we're ready for the conversation, because I'm hoping that we're going to go deep and build on what everyone is thinking and feeling around infrastructure, and then our conversations coming for the rest of the month. So then we will have Marcus Walton come on. Marcus is the CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, and he will lead the infrastructure panel. So again, first the mindful moment, and then we'll have Marcus come on. And be sure to put all of your questions in the chat, because there will be a Q&A following the panel discussion. So please join me in the chat. I look forward to seeing you there.
All right. Am I to begin now? Just want to make sure I'm looking for the video. Yes. Okay. I can't see any kind of. Okay. Awesome. All right. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone who is in the space. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today. My name is Yolo Akili Robinson. I'm the executive director of BEAM, the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. And I have the honor and privilege and opportunity to share a wellness moment with us today, which we'll be doing throughout the course of the month. And essentially what the wellness moment will be is that I will, myself, or maybe members of my team actually, will come in and we will share a simple wellness practice or tool that we can use in our own regular lives. And so every time that we do this wellness moment, we will also feature a specific a document that you can download to actually access and do this tool, all right? So for today's wellness tool, we're going to introduce a really central tool that we use in our work as the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. We find it is really powerful across ages, and it also is really simple, but can be really transformative to how we move through our day. And that tool is called the Feelings Wheel, okay? So I believe I spoke to Anthony and everyone, so you should be able to access that Feelings Wheel, a copy of it in your chat, in the chat. There should be a link to it. So I'm giving you a moment to kind of access that and pull that up. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that tool and why I feel like it's really important and helpful for our work as our work towards our wellness as Black folks in this particular context. So I'll give just a second to let you pull that up. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why that tool is so critical and useful. Okay. A few seconds. All right. And for folks that, who have it open, just like as you're getting ready to open it, or you're opening it now. So if you look at the feelings wheel, the first thing you see is it is a circle, right? And in the core of the circle, you'll see six core feelings, right? Mad, sad, scared, and you'll see different iterations of those feelings as they move out towards the circle. The circle, you see, colors are a little bit darker, increasingly more pastel and light as the different nuances of feelings move towards the outer brim of the circle. So let me explain to you a little bit about why that is. So the feelings wheel is a tool for what we call emotional literacy. It's a tool for us to begin to like name what we're feeling and also connect with where it's happening in our bodies. Because oftentimes we think we're talking about feelings, but we're actually talking about thoughts, our beliefs, our ideas, right? So let me give you an example. Somebody might come to me one day and say, "Yolo, how are you feeling?" And my response might be, "Oh, I just feel like I got to hurry up and get to the store and pick up this and do this, etc." But I haven't given a feeling. I've given a narrative. I've given a thought stream, right? The feeling often is I am scared, I am sad, I am frustrated, I am anxious. Language is often one word. And it's really important for us in our own kind of wellness and healing capacity to really sit with what is the one word feeling I'm feeling? Where is this? What is the sadness, the scare, the fear, the joy, whatever that is? And then ask, where do I feel that in my body? As Black folks, we report higher degrees of what we call semanticization. And what that means is that sometimes we have experiences that we don't process that continue to live in our bodies and shows up as physical ailments, right? Many of us have elders in our communities who might report a shoulder or a leg or other kind of pain that medically are not connected to anything that a Western medical doctor can make sense of, right? Sometimes it's because of somaticization, something that's happened to us that we didn't process emotionally, but the body still held on to. And so it's important for us with the feelings wheel to check in and say, what am I feeling? What is the feeling? And then also, where do I feel that in my body? And what is the message it's trying to tell me, right? Now, there's a couple of things that are really important to contextualize about the feelings wheel, right? One, it's important to name that feelings are not good or bad. They're just information. That's really counter to what a lot of us have learned in our culture. We've learned that we should own our feelings. I shouldn't feel this way. Well, the reality is you feel this way. So that is information. How do you honor that information and integrate that into your life to begin to understand the ways in which you're moving through the world, right? The feelings wheel is also really powerful because many of us as Black folks, we grew up in a culture that gaslit us often and told us our feelings were not valid. We may have grown up in homes or in caregiving situations when people told us our feelings don't matter or they aren't as necessary or as immediate as other physical needs, right? So we see this feelings wheel as a tool to really reclaim our emotions as powerful sources of knowledge, to reclaim the ways in which it gives us insight about what's happening around us and within us, and to really center on that piece, right? Now, I think it's important to once again to make sure we distinguish a feeling from a narrative, right? Because people will come to me, they'll be like, "Oh, feelings aren't facts." I was like, that statement itself has a lot of problems with it, right? First of all, a feeling is always valid, even if the story you're telling yourself that's creating the feeling may be inaccurate and not fully round, right? My feeling might be sadness. The story I'm telling myself that is cultivating sadness within me may not be accurate. I might be telling myself that I'm not enough, that I failed, etc. Those things may not be accurate or fully round, but they're still going to create the feeling which we have to hold and make space for, right? Two, you never want to control your feelings. I think that's something I hear a lot in our communities. Like people need to learn how to control your feelings. I will tell you, as someone who's been in this work for a long time, I do not believe you can control your feelings. What you can do is manage your behaviors in relationship to your feelings. So, for example, I might feel angry all day. I have a right to be angry. That is my feeling. That anger is letting me know something about what's going on within and without in my world. However, if I decide to go out and start throwing things or attacking people, it's not my anger that's the problem, it's my behavior. How am I relating to that feeling through my behavior? And so we want to manage our behavior and be present with our emotions because we can't control them. And control often equates to a repression. It often means that we're repressing our feelings. And what you repress will always return. When we deny our feelings, when we press them down, they pop up in other parts of our lives through our kids, our partners, our family, and they just reemerge. One thing my grandmother says is that what you bury in the backyard will find its way to the front porch. And when it finds its way to the front porch, it will find its way often in the most inconvenient time. So a part of the feelings wheel as a tool was to cultivate a daily practice of checking in with ourselves, looking at the feelings wheel. What am I feeling? Where do I feel it in my body? And what is this information trying to tell me about what's going on within my life around me? How do I make time to process that, to cry, to grieve, to cultivate joy, to sit and let it marinate, the joy or whatever, the gratitude, whatever I'm in? Making that space creates almost like a river flowing through us, as opposed to a blocked river where we're kind of like we're ignoring things and we want to push things aside. How do we create more flow in our lives and within our own kind of bodies and emotional selves is a really critical part of the work. It's important to name that, like, also that within our communities, when we talk about the intersection of sexism and misogyny, we recognize that certain people's feelings are validated more than other folks are, right? We know that for many Black women are taught that their feelings are not their own, that Black women's work is to be the hold the emotional labor of all other members of the community. And so when we push against that in our work at Beam, and we say that actually not only once we understand that misogyny and sexism informs whose feelings get heard and validated, but we have to make sure we understand that we have to validate the feelings of all community members, right? Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it makes us not feel good, right? So really challenging the culture that says that Black women are responsible for the emotional labor of our communities, and saying that it's actually detrimental to Black women's mental health, and that Black men and non-binary folks and other folks need to step up and take responsibility for their emotional labor, but also take responsibility for the harm they may have predicated upon Black women, Black queer and trans women as well, in the context of this emotional labor paradigm, right? So last piece I'll say about the feelings wheel as a tool to kind of everyday check in is in the English language, we often say I am a feeling. We say that I am sadness, I am sad, I am anger. What we encourage at Beam is to think about it the way in saying, instead of saying I am, like in, for example, in French, if you translate from French literally, the statement I have a feeling, I am a feeling, it actually ends up being I have, not I am. Break that down. I kind of got a little muddy right there. In most languages, you don't say I am a feeling, you say I have a feeling. There is something different that cognitively happens for a lot of people when you say I am sadness versus I have sadness. You are much more than your sadness, more than your frustration, more than your anger, all those pieces. So when you have it versus being it can sometimes give us a little bit of distance from it, right? And so when I think about this tool as a wellness moment for our tool, it's really to encourage ourselves to cultivate a practice of paying attention to ourselves. Maybe you take a copy of it and you put it on your wall, but you just check in. What am I feeling? What do I feel in my body? And how do I make space to be more tender and kind to myself within my head, as well as in my heart and other parts with other people, right? And so that's really the offering for the feelings wheel, which we could spend an entire day talking about. We spend a lot more time talking about it. But I want to encourage you to use that tool to kind of cultivate and kick off our wellness moment as Black folks, reclaiming our emotional wellness as critical for our liberation, and our healing as critical for the liberation as well. And that is the wellness moment for today. Thank you all for engaging this piece. And if you have more questions about tools or this tool or other tools, you can go to www.beam.community to find a lot of different graphics, image, videos that you can download to continue this kind of work.
conversation where we focus on infrastructure building. Such an honor to be a part of this conversation. I'm Marcus Walton. As Renee mentioned, I'm currently the president and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organization. And I have the real privilege and honor to be amongst family, to open up this conversation to you with a group of colleagues who bring some very interesting perspectives to this conversation from different points of view, all aligned toward our collective well-being and sustaining movements, particularly in times of crisis. So this question of infrastructure building and how we can support movements, particularly before crisis and beyond crisis, and not just in reaction to crisis, is what we'll ground the conversation in. Our first guest specialist, new family, as I like to say, is Yane Indigo. Yane has a list of affiliations, but I'll just highlight three of the biggest ones here. In addition to being an organizer for National Black Lives Movement Network, in addition to being a lead facilitator of the Black Alliance for Peace, in addition to Black Philly Organizing Collective, Yane also is a leader amongst U Collective, and we'll allow Yane to tell us a little bit more about that in a second. My second guest, again, new family, real pleasure to get to meet, is Emmy Pearson. Emmett is a part of Kansas City, Missouri's nonprofit economic development community. He's a principal, if that's correct, of Community Builders KC, I believe the founder. But Emmy, you'll correct us and tell us where we need to go from there, but really interested in bringing your insights into this conversation. And a dear friend, still family, not as new, but just deepening the roots. Cheryl Dorsey, who is with Echoing Gray and really riding the wave of some recent work done in partnership with Gridspan around racial equity in the field and helping us understand some important dynamics that connect to this issue. So Yane, without any further ado, please give us some insight into how you enter into this conversation around building movements and crisis, particularly before and or after crisis.
Okay, thanks so much for facilitating the conversation. Really excited to be here with you, Marcus, as well as with Cheryl and Emmett. And I want to reiterate that I am an organizer with Black Lives Matter, as well as the Black Alliance for Peace and the Black Philly Radical Collective, and the Youth Cooperative. And so I am out of what is called Philadelphia, what is Lenape-Hoking, the territory, part of the Lenape territory here in Philadelphia. And I'm really interested in the idea of like before crisis versus after crisis, and thinking about the reality that in a lot of ways, since the first colonizing forces were stepped onto these shores, this land has been in crisis. And so I think that really the question is, when we think about, like, when we're talking about this, we're talking about like high level collective crisis moments, like high level moments of collective trauma, and that's what like the example of what's happening right now, the current state of rebellion in the country is right now, is a moment of broad national collective trauma that's happening. And the question, I think, still stands of what do we do in order to prepare ourselves to be in a better position to care for our community when these moments happen, as we move to preventing them from happening, because we've actually shifted and changed and transformed the society that we are living in. And I think that one of the things that's really key is for us to really establish collectively a vision for what it is that we actually would like to see this world be. What it is, how a world can actually function that is full of justice, that is full of equity, that cares for all of the creatures on the planet, and does not have hierarchies of like living creatures, of individuals, even within humanity. And I think that if we build in that way and build with that kind of a vision all the time, when we are in a high level of trauma, when things are in like the form that we are used to operating in, where we have some level of comfort, where at least many of us can feel kind of comfortable. Regardless of that, when we always remember, if there is a lack of equity, that we need to be healing that, we need to be addressing that, not only when it's extreme. If there is a lack of justice, we need to address that reality, and we need to be in ongoing in addressing that reality until that doesn't exist anymore. Right. And what it looks like, what is it that we have to build as an alternative to what's in place right now in order to create an environment where there is perpetual equity, where there is perpetual justice, where people are respected for their right to choose to be autonomous in determining who they are and what kind of person they want to be in the world, and where we honor the planet in which we live. And until we've built that, we should be consistently working. And that is the job for myself. I see that as the job of organizers to be building that. That's the infrastructure that we as organizers have to build for the larger community, so that we aren't forced to engage and uphold a system or systems that do not honor our humanity and our place on the planet.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Yane. And it's a perfect way to start off the conversation. I just want to say to all of those who are listening, this conversation will move so much faster than we wish we had time for. We have about 45 minutes or so after our opening statements. I'll start questions, but along the way, I'm going to invite you all to check into that chat box that you saw listed over there. Make sure you get your questions included into the conversation. I'll be paying attention and incorporating those along the way. And I'll also save a little time on the back end of the conversation to make sure we address any questions that have come up. So thank you, Yane. Let's go to Emmett. Emmett, how are you sitting? How does the question of infrastructure and building support for movements during this moment resonate? What's top of mind for you as an opening statement?
So good afternoon, everyone. And I thank you for allowing me the pleasure of your time. And so I'm Emmy Pearson. And so, Marcus, I am not the founder of Community Builders of Kansas City. A visionary by the name of Chuck Gatson. I stand on his shoulders, rest his soul. So yes, he gave me an opportunity. So, as much as I'd like to take that credit and take that thunder, I cannot, because he really instilled so much passion within me to continue this work 5 minutes away from where I grew up. So Community Builders of Kansas City, we believe in infrastructure by creating economic empowerment through economic development. Our mission is very simple. We change the landscape by igniting and fueling equity, access, opportunity, and advocacy. We do that because we look for those needs that the community brings to us, and we take the first word in our name very seriously, community. We take those unmet needs for goods and services, and we try to address them. We do that over the last 25 years, almost 30 years. Next year will be our 30th anniversary. We do that through good job creation. We employ or cause to employ some 1,000 people on a daily basis. We do that through commercial development. We have some 300,000 square feet of commercial space, all in the urban core of Kansas City, Missouri. We do that by providing Class A office space. Retail development. We are the developers of what amounts to about 150,000 square feet of grocery-anchored retail space. Institutional development. We are the developers of record for one of the largest FQHC, federally qualified health centers in the country. Affordable housing, of course, especially in the big conversations going on throughout this country about affordable housing. Over the last 30 years, we've done about $250 million, all in urban Kansas City, Black folk led, built it for Black folk, and with our newest endeavor to address the systemic food desert that exists not only in Kansas City, but throughout the country. We just acquired a 55,000 square foot grocery store because the operator was retiring. And so we can't talk about healthy community if we can't talk about how we're going to get healthy food. And so we took on that endeavor, put about $1.4 million into that store. The other good thing is not a single person was laid off during this time of pandemic. So when we talk about infrastructure, to be very clear and very blunt, where we do our work, it's always been an epidemic. It's always been a pandemic. We've always had 14.6 unemployment or higher. We've always had, health challenges and health issues. So community builders, we look to how do we begin to create solutions for that? So that's what we're about. That's our definition of infrastructure. We try to physically create the infrastructure that allows economic development to occur so that we can keep this dollar spinning in this community. So I could go on, but I know we have so many other esteemed colleagues on this panel, and I really want to get to the robust discussion that's getting ready to follow. So thank you.
Oh, perfect. Perfectly done. So thank you so much, Emmett. Yane, you introduced a kind of movement framework, a conceptual framework that undergirds our efforts. Emmett, you follow with more of a physical infrastructure and examples of edifice, of buildings, of physical structures to support community thriving in the same way that the conceptual framework offers. Cheryl Dorsey with Echoing Green, how do you think about infrastructure in this context of building movements and sustaining in times of crisis or beyond?
Well, thank you, Marcus. Good to see you again. I'm really honored to be here on the panel today. First time meeting Yane and Emmett. So thrilled to be with you all. And I would say I so appreciate the way that Yane kicked things off, sort of acknowledging the land on which we stand. I'm joining you all from Washington, D.C., the home of the Anacostans, a native Algonquin people here in Washington, D.C. So appreciate sort of recognizing the shared struggle of folks of color and always centering that work. So I think that's so important. I think I'm here on the panel to represent sort of new tools and approaches to add to long-term successful strategies that have driven change over time. I come to this work through the lens of the social innovation movement. For those who don't know Echoing Green, we're an early stage funder of emerging social entrepreneurs, and have really been for over 20 plus years now, really interrogating this work at the intersection of social justice. So how does social innovation and social justice come together to really drive change in a powerful way? And increasingly, Echoing Green and our community being more and more confident in naming social innovation as a powerful cross-sector, alliance-based approach to ending racial and class injustice, really confidently saying we need to add this to the arsenal of other strategies like community organizing, rights-based movements, activism, and recognizing in this moment when entrenched interests that don't have the interests of folks of color and other marginalized folks of color, at heart, how do we sort of add new tools and opportunities and approaches to drive change? And we think this is a moment to confidently sort of center social innovation. And we can absolutely talk more about why that is. And I think it speaks to your question, Marcus, where Echoing Green believes deeply in the transformational work of human capital leadership, right? So how do you think about, leaders of color, institutions led by folks of color, and how their social, financial, political capital that are forged in those leaders and those institutions really do dial up to something incredibly powerful for driving change? So I think in this moment, Echoing Green sort of looks to social innovation, number one, because of the types of leaders it's bringing into the field to join so many other extraordinary leaders who are doing the work and been doing the work, recognizing that sort of an entrepreneurial lens and frame allows you to think about both the work of entrepreneurship, which is about value creation, which Emmett knows so well, but also this notion of value consideration, recognizing that society gives value to everything or devalues folks and institutions and communities. So how do you use that entrepreneurial frame to redirect that? And then finally, recognizing that in the landscape of change strategies, having an approach that ultimately is an alliance-based approach that allows you to go into battle and in some ways say, you don't have to lose for me to win. So how do we think about this shared value creation as a frame that is useful in moments like these? So I'll just leave you, Echoing Green is a funny name. Most people think we're an environmental organization, but it was actually named after a William Blake poem. And one of my favorite William Blake quotes is, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare my businesses to create, which I think is such a nice synthesis of everything that Echoing Green is trying to do in the world.
Wow, thank you. I had to catch myself for a second. I want to be in the audience. I'm just kind of over at the side watching you all, listening, trying to keep up with the notes. Let me just say, thank you again. I hope the audience, I hope everyone involved in this conversation who is actually co-creating this space feels the manner in which each of the comments are building upon the next. I'll just add as a participant in the conversation, and then I'll quiet my voice for the remainder. But it's important to name in this moment of celebrating Black philanthropy, right? Black Philanthropy Month, as an institution whose mission is as a community of funders, to commitment to transforming philanthropic culture and practice to support thriving communities and nonprofits, with a hope and focus of fostering grant-making community that is courageously working in service of nonprofits and communities to create the kind of environment, society that each of you have discussed. It's just critical for us, for me, to be able to name that this moment in time and my participation in this conversation is both from an institutional point of view as well as a very personal one. So the institutional side is this vision for grant makers who are grappling together to be more effective in our work and actually acknowledging, like, wait, if we're not thinking about infrastructure, if we're not thinking about the conceptual, the physical, the entrepreneurial, which I like to just name as creative and sometimes cultural expressions that we need to open up and be a part of as welcome components of our solutions for communities, then we're missing the boat. Then we're not optimally performing at the level of effectiveness that aligns with our highest aspirations for society. So that's my institutional affiliation. But personally, I care about, as Emmy, you named, the shoulders upon which I stand. I'm here because of a legacy of individuals who made it possible for us to have this conversation in an open forum with 100 people present in the conversation or more. I'm here because Dr. King mentioned a riot is the language of the unheard, and that there's a moment in time right now where we all feel a sense of intensity that is akin to a riot. You can say a political unrest. There's unrest that sometimes is defined as crisis, but as Yane mentioned, always exists and perhaps changes in modality and frequency over time. So I'm responding as a personal call to this moment to contribute to a conversation that's based on solutions and that's generative, that is building relationship. So I appreciate you all for being a part of that and contributing your foresight and your frameworks for us to advance this vision in ways that perhaps aren't as easily accessible in other ways, in other spaces. But for now, if you could take us to our first question around the fundamentals. Help us understand, me and other participants in this conversation, and I'll open this up to anyone as a part of our round robin. How do we think of fundamentals for building the kind of support and infrastructure that sustains our efforts during times like today?
Well, I mean, for me, one fundamental is, as I open up my comments, with community. And community is, starting with families, starting with neighbors, those that were able left the community. And so that camaraderie that existed on a block by block scenario doesn't exist to the extent that it did when my mom and when the previous generation came about. So it really starts for us. It starts with community, and we take that seriously. It's being able to talk to your neighbor, being able to hear what they are needing. As we talk about this pandemic, folks that aren't able to get out to go shopping and to go take care of business, it starts with us recognizing that we can't do everything ourselves and listening to the voices of others. For me, that's where it starts. That's a fundamental. And then as a developer, so, I got to have capital, you got to have resources so that we can begin to remove blight, so that we can create economic opportunities, so that we can create jobs. Because guess what? Folk aren't creating jobs for us. We have to create them ourselves, especially in those areas that are, quote unquote, underserved. So those are the fundamentals for me.
Thank you. Anyone else? I feel like I heard a couple of different comments related to this idea of not doing this ourselves. Maybe you can elaborate on that, about other fundamentals, Yanea or Cheryl.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I'll pick up on the capital piece that Emmett mentioned. And I'll come at this from 2 points, sort of, when you look at a lot of the scholarship around movements and sort of the rhythm and stages of movements, you've got sort of emergence, and then there's sort of coalescence of actors. Then you get to the point where the bureaucratization of movements. And I'll stop at those 3 stages, because bureaucratization connotes you need money to do that infrastructure building, that institution building. And that's where the capital really matters. And it speaks to what you alluded to earlier, Marcus, some of the research that Echoing Green has done with our leaders who, these extraordinary best in class leaders of color, especially Black leaders. And when you can compare the amounts of money that they're raising against their white counterparts, the racial inequities are just stark, right? So when we looked at our data set, Black leaders were raising 24% less in terms of revenue than their white-led organizations. But when you looked at unrestricted net assets, they were raising 76% less than white counterparts. And the interesting thing about that research was how those unrestricted net assets were a proxy for trust. So what does it mean to go into this work undercapitalized, where the relationships are not predicated on trust? And I'll use the term Susan Batten, head of Association for Black Foundation Executives. She called it exactly right. She called it philanthropic redlining. And so what do you do with that when you're trying to build movements, and how consequential in a devastating way that can be to folks doing amazing work?
Ooh, do we need to pass the play right now?
Yeah, I'm trying to tell you. Cheryl, can you just talk about say those percentages again?
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, so again, and I was trying to be nice a little bit, but when you look across our portfolio, Black folks raised, their revenues were 24% less than the white folks. But when you looked at unrestricted net assets, they were 76% less. But, within our fellowship community, we've had an extraordinary group of leaders who were part of our Black Male Achievement Fellowship program for the past decade or so. When you look at those Black Male Achievement Fellows, not all Black folks, but mostly Black folks working to improve the life outcome of men and boys of color in this country. When you look at their organizations, the Black folks in that fellowship raised 45% less than the white folks, and their unrestricted net assets were 91% smaller. So the disproportionate, the way they've been locked out of funding streams is just stark and just inequitable.
And I think I heard you correctly when you said that is all a proxy for trust. Whew. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I heard that trust, that change occurs at the speed of trust and actually defines the relationships in some way that form a sort of social capital or infrastructure for the kind of movement building that we're talking about. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I just feel like you were about to bless us with something along those lines.
Well, it's interesting because I was listening and thinking of this in two ways. So, myself, I am a grassroots frontline organizer, right? So, and I work with organizers across the country and around the world. And there's 2 things that come to mind in relation to this. One I'm thinking about right now, Black Lives Matter, right? Which I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter. I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter in Lenape-Hogan, the Philadelphia chapter. And I work with and have relationship with chapters all across the country. And the chapters, we do a lot of focused and hard work. And we are working very hard right now. And because of the moment we're in right now, there's been a lot of resources that have been directed towards Black Lives Matter. And some of it's been directed towards the larger organization, and some of it's been directed towards our chapter. But the thing that's really interesting is how much questioning is being asked of Black Lives Matter. Because there's this idea that people are not asking these very specific questions. What are you doing with every one of these dollars that were donated to you? They're not asking that of the Red Cross. They're not asking that of the Sierra Club. But Black Lives Matter starts to get some funds, and the entire national community decides to put those funds under a microscope and to decide to determine that there's a validation that everyone has to have over whether or not they're entitled to having those funds and using those funds in order to move forward the mission of Black Lives Matter. That's not something that's questioned of other people, and it's being questioned by our own community as well as being questioned outside of our community. And not to say that none of those questions matter, but it's just a really interesting phenomenon when you're talking about this in the context of what kinds of funds other organizing groups get compared to what we as Black Lives Matter has received and what any Black organizing groups have received in the effort to do this kind of forward-moving work. But on top of that, there's also the reality that there are still only certain kinds of groups most of the time that do organizing the Black community that get resources, and they don't tend to be grassroots groups. So the groups that do get resources in the Black community are often the groups that will support a class alignment that does not actually that does not put the system that is oppressing most of the working class communities in any kind of danger. And so that's the other piece of it. Those who really question and challenge the system are the ones who cannot get foundation kinds of finances and funding, do not get big donations, because even though the ultimate goal of grassroots organizers, what I'm trying to see is no one hungry. No one. I'm not satisfied with lowering the numbers and lowering the percentages. I want to see all people fed, 100% of the people on the planet. I want to see all people housed. I want to see all people receiving decent health care. And so there's this idea that because we live in this scarcity, this mindset of scarcity, and which is built within the context of capitalism, which is important so that people believe that poverty is forced, that poverty has to happen, so that we don't look at those who have excessive and extreme wealth and ask those people, and challenge those people's extreme wealth and so that we can kind of justify our pursuit sometimes of extreme wealth at the expense of people who have the least. So while we have this kind of a context, there's this idea that, if those who are dealing with those grassroots ideals are empowered, that they will prevent people from being able to live well and live with wealth, which is not actually true, because we do live in an abundant planet and an abundant society that has every ability to take care of more than just our basic needs, has the ability to provide for our basic needs and many of the things well beyond that we could want and desire. But there's fear based on that. And so those of us who are doing that work of touching and connecting with families who have actually lost their loved ones to violence, or who are in collaboration with people who having in the city of Philadelphia right now, we've got hundreds of people who are living in tents in streets on the street, and have thousands of people who have taken over the housing stock of Philadelphia Housing Authority, who owns houses that are supposed to provide for people who are unhoused, but keeps them empty. And people have to break into them in order to live in them. And so people who are organizing with those people are not getting resources at all. And when our organizing community does get resources, it's questioned. And so I think that's the thing that stands out to me as it relates to what you're talking about, Cheryl, in these percentages, because this mindset and us having it even within our own community also perpetuates that reality.
Yep.
Indeed.
So Marcus, as we talk about infrastructure building, in a crisis or toward a movement, let me just leave you with this. My organization can't do that if we can't garner resources to support ourselves. Now, in full transparency and honesty, we're one of the largest nonprofit organizations in the region. We have, $80 million worth of assets, 55 million of that is net. I have a $1.7 million operating budget. So I'm letting y'all be under the tent a little bit, but ask me how much of that is from philanthropy, of that $1.7 million. And last year, which is my first year here, we got $150,000 of a $1.7 million budget. Out of the $250 million that I have my opening statement with of development over the last 25 years, less than 3% of that came from philanthropy. The hardest dollars for organizations like mine to get is operational dollars. And if you are a successful Black-led organization, what I have seen, at least in my city, is that there is less willingness to support those organizations. And it doesn't go without saying that the money that I did receive from philanthropy came at the direction of African Americans within that foundation. So if they weren't there, I wouldn't have gotten zero. And I know all those folk. We can't talk about sustainability if we're not here. And, the majority community is not trying to come in droves over to help communities that I work in.
Thank you so much. And that's tough. This takes me to a question from our chat room. Thank you so much for those who have started to fire us up there. One comment was that, Yane, to your point, with all of that happening for grantees, we're not asking our own government what they're doing with funds at the same level, which is an irony pointed out by the audience. But there is a set of questions here from a dear colleague that who has some years of experience and has seen some of the issues that Emmett just pointed out. I want to pose this to you as the panel, but then also ask a follow-up question. What the guest here says is, how do we begin to intentionally fund our own movements and build that infrastructure before a crisis? So understanding the structural barriers of a philanthropic landscape, so to speak, how do we begin to fund our own movements? And he says philanthropy may not continue to support this work at all, right? So there's a window of opportunity that may close at any moment. How do we do this for ourselves, and what needs to happen to build community-funded, community-led movement strategies?
So I put my other hat on. So I happen to be the chair of the Black Community Fund here, which was started, which is under the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation here in Kansas City. And it was started 30 plus years ago, now 35 years ago, with the Hall family. So we seek to solicit and garner support within the Black community itself. And we do that a couple of ways. But, from a most basic level is we help to start giving circles, very simplistic, get a couple of folk together and we start to, cobble together a few nickels to help support worthy nonprofits or worthy causes. We're starting there. I know my organization, we try to do that to support and uplift minority businesses with the idea that they will give back. So if we reach in and provide some opportunity, we encourage them to do as well. Personally, I can tell you, I think it has to also start with our next generation. I have two beautiful daughters that, one goes to Howard University or the University of Kentucky. And at a very early age, my wife instilled in them that you have to save, but you have to save and give back. So, $5 here, $7 there. And even now that they have their small jobs, one is an intern for me, we require that they give 10% of that to a charity, preferably to a Black charity. But I think it starts with those small steps and build on those. And I know for those that are impatient like me, that's not always the best answer, but that's an answer that is a place to start from a reality-based answer.
I appreciate that. I think that, I think it's interesting because I come to the conversation from a very different perspective as an organizer, which I appreciate. And I thought about this, and I thought about the ability for our own community to sustain the work that those in our community are doing. And we're doing two kinds of work, right? So like the kind of work that I'm doing, the kind of work that each of you doing, it complements each other, right? And how is it that people are able to sustain that, and how can the community sustain that? And one of the things that I think that really helps with that is small donations that are consistent, to that work that you believe in. And that could be through funneling it through an organization that then supports work like you're talking about, or it could be identifying small organizations that are doing work that you believe in. In Philadelphia, we have our bail funds, we have organizations that work and support and elevate people in our disabled community and our trans community. We have the people, like I said, that are working with the unhoused community, consistently donating to that kind of organizing. Or you may find an organizer or a group of organizers that you support. I actually have individuals who sustain my work with monthly contributions, and so, there are people, everyone's not built for that kind of frontline work. And some people, they have a different kind of life and they can support the frontline organizing that is being done by individuals who are sacrificing those kinds of opportunities in order to be right there, actually building the different kind of society that we all would love to have. And so that's something I think that those kind of small donations, a person saying, I'm going to set aside, $5 or $50 or $100 a month, or a quarter or whatever it is, and contribute that and make sure that I make that kind of a sustained contribution is something that could be really valuable for a lot of different kinds and different levels of organizing. And certainly when I look at the kinds of frontline organizers that I work with, who often are, housing insecure, that are actually living the same problems that they're working to address, that kind of support could be very transformative in sustaining their ability to stay in the work.
Oh, Yane, oh goodness, I appreciate that so much. I dropped a little note over there to kind of summarize what I'm hearing from each of you. Giving Circles, which is a working in partnership with community foundations, is some of the image that you were describing. Making small donations, consistent donations, being an individual donor is how we sometimes talk about what you describe, Yane. I'm realizing now, one of the things I really appreciate your contribution to this conversation is I'm a former, once you're an organizer, you're always an organizer. So I'm not a former anything. I continue to organize that lens to support effective philanthropy, collective visioning, and developing action plans for implementation towards shared agendas in the sector, right? And there's an absence of these common agendas because we tend to move toward action based on a sense of urgency that really is always there. It just changes from topic to topic. And so this is all important. But one of the other things you reminded me is, and I remember this when I was significantly younger, attempting to do this work, and it's that at some point, we want our elders to be able to graduate towards something, right? I don't necessarily need to be standing next to an elder on the front lines of social movement. That's not always the best sign. And so you just help direct me as I get a little little pain in my elbows and knees that I didn't used to get, a little up in age, and just energy focused in different directions, you just gave me a pathway towards supporting movement in a different way. You know, I can't do it like I used to do in the South Bronx 20 years ago, but I can make specific donations directly to the cause. And I actually have not heard enough people just name that as a possibility. So I want to underscore that here and make my own personal commitment. Thank you for that. Cheryl, I haven't heard your voice in a minute, but I know that brain of yours. It's like I can hear you out loud. What do you have going on in there in terms of responses to this conversation so far?
No, look, I think Yanae and Emmett said it beautifully. I mean, I would say that I agree with the giving circles. I think what we see in giving is the power of peer-to-peer modeling at whatever level. So I think sort of allowing people to be in community with one another is incredibly important. That's one thing. So doing more of that is even more important. And there's some interesting work that's been done over the years from back in the day. Our program officer from the Ford Foundation, Lynetta Gilbert, extraordinary person who was really pushing, right? Giving circles.
Thank you, Lynetta.
Right?
Yes.
Amazing. So that's built on a rich tradition of her leadership. And there are folks who are buzzing around now, really thoughtful, brilliant folks like Liz Thompson out of Chicago, starting to think about how do you get Black folks of means together to start driving money to leaders of color and organizations run by folks of color. Really important. I think fundamentally, and this speaks to the work that Emmett does, is that folks of color tithe a lot, disproportionate to their level of wealth. So when you start thinking about how do you unlock more giving, you got to start talking about the racial wealth again, right? So there's some economic development work that has to be underneath all of this if we're to be the rising tide that lifts all boats. So you start to get into sort of structural issues and structural approaches that unlocks more capital and wealth and opportunity to support the institutions that we care about.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I can't type fast enough. Thanks so much for just naming. And there's a question, kind of comment in the chat room that aligns with everything that just happened with that part of the conversation. It's a reminder, actually, that the Giving USA reports, and many of you probably have heard of those. Giving USA tracks. There's a bunch of different entities that track philanthropic giving in aggregate. And over, it was like this 10 years ago, probably 20 years ago, I know 30 years ago, the percentages of investment overall from the philanthropic sector is dwarfed by individual donors. Individual donors consistently are the highest percentage of donors to charitable efforts. And so we should, if the trajectory of history is anything to be relied upon, that won't change anytime soon. So we don't want to put all of our eggs in the philanthropic basket as much as look to establishing those relationships of trust. Let's go deep and broad, right? Because trust, as we know, change occurs at the speed of trust. And if trust characterizes our relationships, we can do some of the things like support those important advocacy efforts without the need to scrutinize and micromanage and get in the way of the work itself, and just support the good work that's being done and ask how we can also be of service. Time is flying, and that was my promise that it would. We are at 13 minutes and counting, and so I'm going to ask one more question for each of you to respond to in whatever way you're led, and then I'll invite you to closing remarks. Okay. And along the way, I've asked the questions in the chat room, and so I'll continue to do that and encourage our participants. Get those last minute questions in. I'll promise to try to get it in there for you. Having said all of the things that we've said and covered the ground, the territory that we've covered for specific strategies, identifying barriers, talking about funding and the importance of individual donors, how do you recommend that we think about systems in a different way? if we could just decolonize our thinking completely, what might we replace these systems with that better supports our vision for our communities? Easy question.
I love that question, actually. It's really actually a focus of mine, because one of the things that I observe quite often is that we have these systems that are in place, and then we have people who try to, what I call blackface these white systems, right? And so we have like structures that have been built out of by a particular community, and it's white supremacist specifically in that the idea that has been perpetuated is that that's the only way that it can function, right? That this system, whatever the system is, this is the way it's supposed to be. And there is no alternative that would be correct, because this is what is correct. And so what people try to do when they take that on is they try to just like put some black into it. But, you know, white supremacy with a black face is still white supremacy, right? Oppression is oppression if it's oppression. It doesn't matter really who the agent of that oppression is. And so I think it's really important for us to begin to see like that everything has been built by all of these systems are built by people, and the people who build most of the systems that we are subjecting ourselves to or perpetuating did not build them for us. They built them in order to empower themselves to maintain, to hold and hoard the majority of the planet's resources away from the majority of people. So we can remember that even though right now we go and we work jobs in order to get colored money so that we can, or colored paper, so that we can purchase food, we could at least remember that that food was provided by the planet for free. The planet does not require colored paper in order to give us food. We have accepted this idea that the food can be locked up and that somebody can be an intermediary between us and what the earth has provided for us for free. And so that's just one example. We can look at all of these systems, the system of education. We have to have a first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. You have to learn these competencies to move on to anything else. Like all of these things should be questioned, and we should be looking at like really just what is a human being and what moves them to their best self, and how do they interact best with other humans and with the planet, and what kinds of systems do we need to put in place that will, without thinking about throwing away all of the other systems, that actually will accomplish that kind of a goal. And I think looking at completely other systems, looking at indigenous communities around the world, the way that they do, the way that they practice things and the way they approach things, looking at alternative national communities. Cuba's got a great example of an alternative. Venezuela has great examples of alternative. We've been demonizing the system. The national community here has created a narrative that demonizes these alternatives, and we really would benefit from studying these alternatives, because there's a massive amount of power and a massive amount of goodness in these alternative systems. And so, yeah, I think that there's an amazing opportunity that we have right now, particularly with our younger people. Like the millennials are really brilliant, and the millennials are not accepting the limitations and the constructs that they've been born into as being a part of nature, and are ready to imagine all alternatives. And so we've got a great opportunity, especially with the raising of this particular community, our younger people, to really reimagine what's possible and build something completely anew.
Oh, powerful. Thank you. I'm just looking at the time, and I appreciate the family that we have here. It's only fair. I don't want to put you in a tough position to rush through any comments. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity for a final word. You have enough time for 2 minutes or so. What is it, based upon this conversation, what you're feeling, what's top of mind, just kind of based upon the tapping of the collective genius, opening up to the intuition that this space is revealing. What is it that is present with you to share with this group as closing remarks for those of us who are interested in what can we do? What are some action steps that we can take to operationalize some of the things that we talked about today?
So I think for me, I find myself at least once a week asking this question: is that a policy or is that a practice? And I find it, along the lines of banks and others, that don't tell me what you can't do. Tell me what you're open to listening to doing. Woo. Because I already know I have, centuries of what you can't do, what you're not going to do. But tell me what you're opening to listening to do. So again, one thing would be, is that a policy or is that a practice? And I was never good at coloring inside the line. So if it's a policy, then we probably got to bump up against that policy. The other thing that's top of my mind is that I'd like to just go back to a little bit of the whole philanthropy and supporting the work that folk on the panel are doing. And, the question is, or really the statement should be, we talked about, how do we begin to support each other and support organizations? For those that are in philanthropy that can stroke a check, if you see an organization or a group that is doing good work, reach out to them. Don't let them figure out how to reach out to you. Because in many instances, those that are in the larger foundations or just a foundation in general, it's a hard place to crack. People fund people. People fund who they're comfortable with. So for those in philanthropy, if you see someone doing great work, reach out to them and say, hey, let me talk a little bit more about what you're doing and go ahead and fund them. Don't make them jump through all the hoops and metrics and all that good stuff. Reach out to them first, especially if it's some young brothers and sisters, because, there are not enough of us getting ready to take on the banner and the torch moving forward.
Thank you so much. Great start there. Yanae, you just went. Cheryl?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Appreciate this really important conversation. Learned a lot. I would just say, came out of public health and healthcare. And so this moment that we're living through with the global pandemic top of mind, when we're probably going to lose about 230,000 fellow Americans by Election Day. We are in a moment, in an existential moment. And there's a historian, Frank Snowden, who writes a lot about the history of pandemics. And he wrote a very famous book called Epidemics in Society. We all know this, that these pandemics simply amplify and magnify the structural inequities that already exist. They just shine a light on it. But he also talks about how they represent transformational moments, societal transformational moments. And there's a fork in the road for which one we could take. There are historical examples of horrific outcomes, but also really powerful leaps forward. And the question is, and I guess my call to all of us is, how do we remain stewards of this moment, holding and demanding that this is a moment for positive transformation, right? Historically, when we've seen sort of these uprisings before, we snap back, and you get the Kerner Commission, but you also get these law and order narratives where you take 3 steps forward after you took 1 step 3 steps back, 1 step forward. How do we hold our collective feet to the fire to ensure that this is a moment of progress? It's going to require the collective political will of all of us. And there are very powerful forces arrayed against these conversations that do not want it to be so. So what is our individual and collective responsibility in this moment before we move ahead, having shut the window without making some of the progress in this moment that is required?
Thank you. And Yanae, you're going to get the last word. Thanks for starting us. You get to close us out.
Well, thank you. There's 2 things that I really have in mind, and I appreciate, Cheryl, what you said as far as like this moment and the fact that we live in a system that is doing its best to sanitize this moment, but we really do need transformation, and we have to not forget. We have to keep the fire and not forget why there were thousands upon thousands of people in the street, and why people are setting police cars on fire and burning police stations. We can't forget that. But this is also, August is also, it's Black August, and so this is a month that really it calls for the lifting of our political prisoners And so I would really be remiss to lead this conversation without mentioning the fact that we have so many political prisoners that we have to continue to fight for, who have been fighting, many who are in prison for things that they are innocent of. We have Imam Jamil Al-Amin, we have Sundiata Akoli, we have Ranza Bowers, of course, Mia Abu Jamal, Russell Schultz, Kamal Siddiqui, Ed Poindexter, Dr. Matula Shakur, Jalil Montakim, so we have to remember our political prisoners, and we can support our political prisoners the same way that we can support the organizers that are in the movement. We can support our political prisoners by writing them and just remembering them and letting them know that they're there. We can do a little research because sometimes they have petitions, sometimes they have court cases. There are things that we can call about them, and we can also put money on their books. And we can also remember that when we do get them released, that they need a community and they need stability to come home to. And, and that's something that does not always happen. Recently, Delbert Africa was released from prison. He was released healthy, did not have the resources needed, and Delbert Africa recently passed away. He was not out of prison for a year after being in prison for over 40 years, being in prison when his child had a bomb dropped on her by the city of Philadelphia while he was in prison. And so that's one of the things we have to make sure we take care of our movement folk when they are released. And we can also finally just with the individuals who are members of the movement community, we can, if we are not doing the work, we can support the work. We can fund the work, and that way we are all a part of the movement. Either you're front line or you're funding the front line. That's my last word on that.
Beautiful. And on that note, I'd just like to thank you all for your participation. Yane Indigo, Emmy Pearson, Cheryl Dorsey, I'm Marcus Walton. Thank you all for your time and participation. I appreciate you. So much gratitude. We can all be a part of the work. Let's fund it. Let's fund this work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, y'all. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this first conversation of Unbound Talks as part of Black Philanthropy Month. We're so excited that you were here. Infrastructure was what we kicked it off with, but we got many more to come every Thursday for the rest of the month. The next one, next Thursday, the 13th. Join us for Black Boys versus Black Girls. Is this really what we want? And also look forward to additional materials coming out around what we learned today and what we can do in the future. I'm so grateful that you were all here. Thank you to the panelists, Marcus Walton, Yane Indigo, Cheryl Dorsey, Emmy Pearson Jr. It was an amazing conversation, and I look forward to working with all of you in the audience as well as all of the panelists. Thank you.